Welcome to the second in a trio of talks led by Janet and Axten, coinciding with the 21st birthday of Tate and Ives. My name is Sam Thorne, I'm the Artistic Director of Tate and Ives, and it's my pleasure to be introducing today Isabel Carlisle, who will be in conversation with Janet. Isabel currently leads on education programs for the Transition Network, where there's a focus on place and community, and is a founder member of the Community Chartering Network. She was an art critic for the Times between 93 and 98. I think it's probably that period that you're going to be focusing on for some of the conversations today, where she regularly covered Tate and Ives. After that, Isabel was a curator at the Royal Academy up until 2002, and while she was at the RA, curated a wonderful Terry Frost retrospective. And there's just a quick plug, we're also doing a Frost retrospective next, opening October 2015. She now lives in Totnes and is visiting today. Yes. Janet, who I'm sure many of you know, moved to St Ives almost 30 years ago. From 88 to 99, she was Patrick Herring's personal assistant. After that, until Brian Pearce's death in 2007, she was Brian Pearce's personal assistant and published 2 books on his work. Janet was also a key member of the Stag group and co-published The Story of Tate and Ives, which I would recommend if you haven't already read it. Janet is also the co-founder of the St Ives Archive. So today, Janet and Isabel are going to be talking about all kinds of things. One emphasis will be cultural tourism. Because it's quite a small group, I think we're battling with good weather outside. Janet mentioned maybe it could be slightly more of an interactive talk. So rather than leaving questions to the end, I think do jump in. We have an hour and a half, something like that. So yeah, we'll play it by ear, I think. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Janet and Isabel.
Well, thank you very much for coming along and joining the second discussion. Those who came to the first one when I talked to Mike Tooby, we looked at how the Tate came about, but how Mike saw it through his own eyes, and being the curator here, both before it opened and after it opened. And when I was asked to lead these 3 discussions, and I'd already met Isabel and knew the things that she was interested in, and it suddenly occurred to me that the reason the Tate is here is not because of the St Ives artists. The reason the Tate is here is because Cornwall County Council wanted to do something to bring tourists back to Cornwall, because most of them, or a lot of them, were leaving in the 70s to have their holidays in Spain. And so Cornwall was in a really bad way, and St Ives particularly. And so they supported the idea of having a gallery here, because what they were doing was looking at developing cultural tourism. And words weren't really used very much in those days, were they? I mean, it's a relatively new term. And I thought that the discussion with Isabel, because of her background, was just perfect to look into this in depth, because it's very fascinating, I think. But before we start on that, I want to talk to Isabel a bit, because as you heard, she started out writing articles for the Times about St Ives, the gallery. And I was so fascinated that it was so different from how I'd met her and the reason I'd met her, that I'd like to ask you how you got involved in that, and why you started writing about the St Ives artists.
Well, in London, I was writing for the Times at that time for about 4 or 5 years in the 90s. And at that time, the leading art critic always chose what he wanted to review. So Richard Court was the leading art critic, and he would review the leading exhibitions in London, or he would go to kind of key metropolises in this country or abroad. And I got increasingly kind of curious about the fact that art critics weren't being sent to the provinces. They weren't reviewing stuff that was happening outside the big centres. And being me, always looking for the gaps and the opportunities, I thought, well, you know, Tate's and Ives is open, they're putting on really interesting shows. I'm going to ask if I can go and review some of those exhibitions. And in fact, I made it a bit of a mission while I was one of the deputy art critics to go to places that weren't so well known or weren't so well covered.
Well, that's really interesting, because I think one of the things, and I'm also going to be looking at that further in the next talk with Chris Stevens, curator, because there is this provincialism, isn't there? But especially in the 1980s, that London was really, the 90s, was at the end of, was the be-all and end-all, and everything else that went on was of no interest or no importance. So you obviously, well, thank you for...
And I think, Janet, when I looked back at my reviews and I said to you, I'm slightly ashamed of the kind of slightly snooty attitude that I was taking. Because at that time, for instance, Tate Britain had kind of brought in its policy of doing this annual rehang of the galleries. And so kind of transferring that thinking to Tate's and Ives. I and other art critics were saying, well, how can you keep on revolving a display at Tate's and Ives when there isn't actually an awful lot of material to show? So, you know, we were falling into a trap of trying to kind of impose London thinking, if you like, on other places, which are very different.
And then you moved to the Royal Academy. What made that change come about?
It was kind of happenstance in a way, that I was getting a bit bored of my job at the time, so I wanted a new challenge. And a position as exhibitions curator came up at the Royal Academy. And I had never had any formal training in art, as it were. I kind of learned on the job, as I always have. And one of my very first jobs when I was very young, in my early 20s, was working for Professor Ernst Gombrich as a person assistant. And I worked at the Warburg Institute in London, which is all about the survival of the antique tradition into the Renaissance. So quite, you know, quite scholarly places, if you like. But so I'd always been exposed to art, but I never studied art. I studied archaeology. And what really attracted me to the Royal Academy was this opportunity to look at many different kinds of art, many different periods of art, many different traditions of art, because the Royal Academy is free to do all sorts of things that other galleries perhaps don't do. And they welcomed somebody who had my kind of background, who'd been in archaeology, but had also been roaming through the art world, more or less kind of in a self-directed way, according to which shows were on.
And then you changed completely.
Yes, I changed completely, because I have to say that this is going to sound slightly challenging perhaps, but at the Royal Academy I began to see the art world as being this bubble that wasn't really connected to what was happening in the wider world of politics and society. And I especially began to notice how people went to the Royal Academy to have kind of religious experiences in front of the art. And I got slightly tired of that. Sorry, that's a really kind of sacrilegious thing to say in a way. But I don't think that's what art's about. And I thought, you know, I don't think art's about that. And I can see all these challenges happening in the world around us. I want to do something that challenges the art world, and challenges me, and challenges the wider world as well, to see that art has a role to play here. So when I left, I had the seed of an idea to create a festival around the Muslim world. And I set up something called the Festival of Muslim Cultures. And I left the Royal Academy about 2002. About 2003 I began to think about how can we do this festival. Because what I saw was the rise of Al-Qaeda. I don't even remember at that time, but Al-Qaeda was mainly in North Africa, and nobody quite understood it. And I thought, you know, nobody understands it. They don't even understand Muslim culture, really. But when I had been very young, I was 20, 21, I worked as an archaeologist in Jerusalem, and was very touched, if you like, by meeting with both Jews and Arabs in Jerusalem, and felt that I wanted to give something back, and particularly giving something back, I suppose, more to the Arab world there, because we'd engaged with Arabs and had been surveying Arab buildings. We were in all the buildings around the Dome of the Rock, and doing a survey of the Mamluk buildings, and in a funny way I just wanted to give something back. And I thought, well, I think arts connect us at the level of basic shared human experience. And that's what I want to do here. I want to see if it's possible to connect with another culture that isn't our own, but exists within our own culture, and see if we can connect with it in a very different way, not political commentary, and not kind of, religious standoffs, but do it in a very different way. And I was fortunate enough to gather a team of people around me, Muslims who came onto the board of trustees, all sorts of people who came onto the board of advisors from many different faiths and backgrounds. And also, having been in the art world, I could kind of talk to a lot of art galleries and other kind of arts institutions up and down the country and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing. Do you think it's a good idea? Do you want to join in? Maybe you want to contribute something. And I was really amazed at the response, because now, this was after 9/11, a lot of the art world felt, we want to do something here. We want to kind of give something back in some way. And the Arts Council was also encouraging arts organisations to attract more diverse audiences. So we were kind of ticking the right boxes. And then we were fortunate enough to, post 9/11, we had various Muslim governments like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan who also wanted to build bridges. So I often think that something, we talked about this in relation to Tate and Ives, when the time is right, something will happen in a way that you could never imagine it would ever happen. And we somehow entered a window and were able to do things which I don't think you could do now. You couldn't have done before 9/11.
Well, you can understand why I thought you just the person to discuss this wider issue, because I think it is a very wide issue, and I hope that by the images that I've put together after we talked about the sort of things we want to raise, that I think it make everyone think about things in St Ives and how a place actually develops when you do something quite unusual to it. Before we start, for those who would like just a short sort of quote about what cultural tourism actually is, I think this will help, because it does carry on from what you were saying, because cultural tourism is the subset of tourism concerned with a country or region's culture, especially the lifestyle of the people in those geographical areas, the history of those people, their art, architecture, regions, and other elements that help shape their way of life. Cultural tourism includes tourism in urban areas, particularly historic or large cities and their cultural facilities such as museums and theatres. It can also include tourism in rural areas, showcasing the traditions of indigenous cultural communities and their values and lifestyle. It is generally agreed that cultural tourists spend substantially more than standard tourists do. This is interesting. This form of tourism is also becoming generally more popular throughout the world, and a recent OECD report has highlighted the role that cultural tourism can play in regional development in different world regions. But this little bit is interesting. One of the consequences of increasing public sector intervention in cultural tourism, and of course St Ives, the Tate here, did come about because of money from Cornwall County Council, so that was the public sector intervention, it wouldn't have happened otherwise, has been a vastly increased supply of cultural attractions in recent years. In Europe, for example, the number of cultural attractions is estimated to have grown by over 100% in the last 20 years, actually outstripping the growth of demand. So, it's interesting, isn't it? Learn all sorts of things. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. And I start off with, just look at these pictures. There's a photograph of the gallery, one of those iconic photographs. And I showed the first two or three when I was with talking to Mike Tooby. But you were saying that when you wrote one of your articles, you wondered how the gallery was going to keep going or keep being bring people in if they were just sort of circulating the same paintings all the time, and which I think is interesting. And when you look at this picture here, which is I think Mike giving a talk about the Pusillanimir, look at the amount of space on the wall with 3 pictures. That there weren't really an awful lot, were there? which is interesting. But a lot of people said, oh, there's not many works in the gallery, whereas now, of course, it's rather different. So, but it was interesting that you raised that subject about having one collection of paintings. Certainly, Mike did have study displays, and they were very interesting, and we talked about those.
Yeah.
One of the important things, one of the really great spin-offs of Tate St Ives was its education programme. And this is the room that is now the resource room, which used to be called the studio, and you see full of, at that time, full of young people all working away. And the Tates always had a fantastic outreach programme. And here we have Kerry Rice talking to children actually in the gallery themselves, and also working outside the gallery, doing projects, looking over at the landscape. So, what I'm trying to do is to see how the Tate has changed the town. What we're going to be doing is looking at what it was like beforehand, and also what it was like after it was built, because it's 21 years old. The sort of, you'll see this photograph was taken in the 70s when they were just building the turn, you know, where you've got the one-way street system, and just outside the Tate where the cars have to turn round. Until that time it was all two-way traffic. And in 1985, which is sort of crunch year for me in this, is when they finally demolished the last bit of the gasworks. That big holder was there until 1985. And that actually coincided with the big exhibition at the Tate Gallery, the St Ives exhibition. So 1985, as I say, was a really interesting year. It was also the year I came down, so for some reason, you know, it's kind of on my mind. And we'll show you that picture, which I haven't shown before, which I apologise for, because that is the architect's impression. We all got terribly excited about how it's going to look, because the important thing was how it fitted into the meadow flats on either side. What do you think, Isabel, with your interest in architecture as well?
Yes. Well, I love that picture. I remember that picture quite well. And I always thought it looked a bit like a kind of Whistler painting, because you could see the reflections in the water. But I mean, looking at that, it does look very homogeneous. It's all kind of blending together in a rather astonishingly successful way, I think.
It was very interesting because when it first went before Cornwall County Council's planning committee, they weren't really primed to pass it, and some of them, the councillors were horrified and said, but it should be built of granite. And anyway, luckily they took no notice. But the others said that it looked like an Odeon cinema. I don't know what to think about that. And here's a picture of it actually being constructed. There's still some scaffolding on the outside. It was when I talked about this at the last discussion, and how difficult it was to work out exactly what it was going to look like when it was covered in scaffolding. And there's a finished photograph of it. I think Colin Sanger took that with the Barnoon Cemetery next to it. And notice the buildings behind in Barnoon Terrace, because that's how it was at the time it opened, and there we have it from the other point of view. So you can see how it linked in. Right, well, one of the things I wanted to raise was the fact that when the Tate came, it was the catalyst for all sorts of other projects. I don't know, have you come across that sort of thing before? Do you think St Ives has worked particularly hard, or do you think that if you have something really important that you do get a spin-off with other projects?
I'm sure you get a spin-off with other projects. I mean, I think these big interventions like the Guggenheim Bilbao, Tate and Ives, they just open up the space of possibility. It fires up people's imaginations and more things start to happen and come in.
Well, this is the Leech pottery. Just before it was redone, and you can see it was in a very, very sad state, and it needed massive work. But if I show you what it looks like now, everyone worked very hard. I think what was fascinating about these other projects was that, and the Tate, it involved the local community. Have you come across that before? Do you feel, what role do you think the community plays in these things? Do you think we're unusual, or do you think that's what happens all the time?
I think that's quite unusual to really involve the local community in thinking about what they want to see happen in that space.
Really?
Yes, I think most big arts interventions like that, well, certainly at that time, maybe since that time, there's been more community engagement. But I think at the point at which Tate St Ives was building, that was quite unusual.
Well, as you know, because we set up the St Ives Tate Action Group, and we originally set up to raise awareness and help the Cornwall County councillors to vote for it. But we very quickly decided that it would also be a fundraising group as well. And of course, we raised £135,000, which was brilliant. But it got us working as a team, and so when the Leech pottery needed to be developed, there was a support group to make sure that everyone was kept informed and helped to raise awareness. And the other big project, of course, is this one that we're sitting in here. And there's the studios when they were in a really dreadful state, and they probably wouldn't have lasted another year, I should think, because I showed that first, because if we just go back in time, this is not actually Porthmeor Studios, but you can see the way some of these spaces were used, and this is, as you see, making nets. But what is so fascinating is a group of people in the back having a look, obviously they were doing it for let's bring in the general public and let them share in it. Anyway, this is what happened in a terrible storm, and it was really bad. But again, that was a tremendous project in getting lots of money, and again a support group to make it happen. And Isabel hasn't seen any of these photographs before. She's asking about the different levels, and I was explaining that the level between the road and the beach is very different. It's on the side of a hill, but you can see all the levels, and we're in the one not at the top, but the one below. That's where we are. And we've still got the fishermen underneath, and that's really important, because it's been the fishermen and the artists who've worked together and lived together that has made this building as important as it is, and the reason that it's still in existence. And I just mentioned our archive, because we started that 18 years ago to collect information together, and we certainly wouldn't have done that if the Tate hadn't been here. And this very much lives with local people, because what we wanted to do, we didn't want to have another art project. What we wanted to do was to collect the history of the whole town, because you can't separate the art from the town.
Yes.
And so this is a group of nice elderly gentlemen. We gave them tea and saffron buns and told them to start talking, and they did, as you see, which is really important. And then we've got the School of Painting, which is just above us. And this is what it looked like before it was restored, the building was restored. And this is what it looks like now. Actually, that's in Studio 5, isn't it? When they were, is that right? When they moved?
Yeah, I think it is.
When they moved in temporarily, thinking about it. But you get the feel of the, much more modern place. And this was a project, I wanted to include this because we all got together and worked on an oral history project called Memory Bay, which was collecting the memories of people living in this town who remembered the artists. So Chris is there representing Portsmouth Studios. It was run by John Packard, here on the left. And this was a visit to the Tate, and the idea was to we collected over 100 recordings. So this is another thing, that, and that's a picture of me in the Tate. We had a Super Sunday, and there was an exhibition of Alfred Wallace's paintings. And we talked to the children. They all had to write a postcard to Alfred Wallace and say why they liked his painting, The Wreck of the Alba. And then I had to interview them. It was absolutely charming. It was really lovely. Anyway, so that sort of gives you an idea. I really sprung this on Isabel because to give you a feeling of how the Tate has really made an enormous difference to the culture of the town and how it's involved lots of different people. Have you got any sort of, quickly whizzing through those, have you got any remarks to make about that?
I think it's really important to look at these they're almost like iconic images, particularly the gasworks. I think it's really important to kind of pinpoint them, to see that kind of progression that happened. And I'm very interested in this notion of culture because they're obviously, in a sense, there's kind of high culture and low culture. And I think when we talk about cultural tourism, we almost need to start distinguishing between the two. Because when I think about, well, I suppose my work at the moment is much more about much bigger picture thinking about how do we make communities more resilient for the future in a world of climate change and economic contraction and things like that. So I think more and more that culture is kind of everything. Culture isn't just the kind of moments of high art or preserving things. It's also kind of what's going on in the community, or what used to go on in the community, and what the memories are. So oral history projects are very important to surfacing the memories.
Well, when I was talking to you on the phone, you said you thought it was quite a good idea to look and see how St Ives developed and the sort of work that people were actually doing in the past. And St Ives was well known for its mining, and that's a console, so that's up at the top past the Leach pottery. If you know St Ives well, the church on the left is St John in the Field. And I mean, you just wouldn't recognise it. I mean, there's that, all that winding machinery, and I mean, it's just extraordinary, really. Yes, what to say, headgear. And
what are they mining, Janet?
Tin.
Tin, yes.
But not here. Now, this is really interesting because this is Trenwith Mine, and this is just below this is just beside the top car park. And if you look at the area between Trenwith car park and the Park Avenue car park below, there's nothing but looks like trees and shrubs. But actually, that is the great Trenwith Mine. And the importance of Trenwith Mine was that it reopened. It had mined tin in the 19th century. Then it closed, like a lot of the mines did. But at the beginning of the 20th century, they discovered pitchblende. And it was the council that owned it, and they leased the mine out to a consortium of German businessmen. And they mined the pitchblende and sent it to London to be turned into radium. And if you read the newspaper reports, they had no idea of how dangerous radium was, and they were talking about this and sort of digging it up. And they knew that it was going to be able to help with saving lives, but nobody realised just how dangerous it was. And the rumour has it that Marie Curie used some of the radium and that it was the best radium in the world, but perhaps that was just the local newspapers. But of course, what happened in 1914, 100 years ago, went to war with Germany, and that was the end of that, and it was the company went bankrupt and closed down, never to reopen. But the point is that under the ground there is radium and also uranium. So, well, it will probably be about 1910, because by 1914 it wasn't in use anymore. So, you know, they say the pavements in London is paved with gold, but St Ives is paved with uranium, which is rather interesting. Much more exciting, isn't it? So, I mean, and we showed this to the school children because the junior school is just across the way, and said, "Do you know that you have a mine across the way?" And they have no idea at all. It's really important to remember this. And here, I mean, look at that. That's about the same thing. That's up at Consul's mine. I mean, you're looking 100 years ago. You're looking at such a different world, aren't you? There they are. They've got their candles in their helmets, sort of stuck down with some kind of putty or something.
Yeah.
But I love that. And then, of course, there's the fishing. And I could carry on and on with the fishing, because I just the fishing fleet was huge, and very often the harbour was absolutely full of boats. It was a wonderful place for children to play. But you've got to remember that most of St Ives, down on all this part, was very poor. There weren't many amenities, and everybody helped with the fishing industry to make a living, and if there was no fish, there was no money. And a bit later on, this is sort of the 1950s, you've still got quite a number of boats, although it really was dying out. But there, like the picture of the miners, there's a picture of the families involved in the fishing, again about 100 years ago, and you're looking at a different world. But those are the people who were here, who were sort of the mainstay, because there were professional people up in the town, but this was down here.
Yeah.
And we mustn't forget about the industry, and around Porth Gwynn and the island, we have a lot of small factories, and the one which is where St Nicholas Court is, was the Crusade Silk Factory, and it employed about 150 workers around 1930. So that's how this town made its money. And of course there were the artists. This is an earlier picture, and you see an artist has come in. They were all visitors, and the little boys, the little locals, were interested in watching what was going on. And of course we must remember the tourists, because you've got St Ives, you've got the people who are living here and the tourists who came down. And as soon as the railway came in 1877, so the tourists arrived. And here's the railway line coming in, and with the Porthminster Hotel above, which was built soon after the railway opened 20 years later. And there's the wonderful old station that used to be made of granite, just below the terrace. And of course, it was all taken out and turned into a giant car park. Now, so can we look at the tourism for a moment? Because I think that's important. This is Porthmere. And remember, the gasworks is at Porthmere, so it was a pretty smelly, nasty place. And also, the people who lived there were not, it wasn't a place where the holidaymakers came, generally speaking. You do see, which is wonderful, some of the bathing machines, but otherwise it looks quite lonely, and it was a place where the locals and the children came to play. And you can see the Porthmere studios there in the back. In the 1930s, it kind of got its act together a bit, and there was tea rooms. Or what you did was you ordered your tea and it came to you on a tray with a teapot, and china teapot and cups and saucers. It was rather smart. And you've still got the bathing machine, but now you've got some tents. And then, and also a bit later on, look, there's the gasworks. I mean, it's hardly beautiful, but generations of children have made sandcastles on that beach. Now look at Porth Gwynn. This is before they built there's that building right in the middle is where the cafe is now. There were no changing rooms, and so many people used to come and have their holidays under canvas. So these sort of, they look like Boy Scout tents, don't they? But everyone had tents like that. And then Porthminster, which of course was the very first bathing beach, which was popular. And so it's sort of around 1900, here we've got the bathing machines again and a few tents. You can see the fishing boats in the harbour. And then, of course, later on, it's absolutely full of, actually I should show that one first, because I still remember the rows of tents getting more and more windswept and lighter in colour as they were there year after year, and then they got rid of them, and then everyone has windbreaks. And I was talking to Cassie, and I said, well, of course, in the 60s there were the beatniks, and she said, I hope she doesn't mind saying, what's a beatnik? And this was, I think this is really interesting about tourism, because until around 1960, families went off on holiday, and young people didn't go on their own, they went with their parents. In the early 60s, everything changed because young people had a bit of disposable income. They also were going to college, and they became very independent, and they started taking holidays on their own and with their friends, and they'd come down with their guitars. And we didn't have any modern rockers here, but I know as I no fights, but it caused absolute havoc in this town, because the boys were actually growing their hair a bit long. I mean, they look like a pop group, don't they? There. And this wonderful wall, which was a horrible wall, which was built in front of the sloop inn, they all sat on the wall. They also did other things on the wall as well, which absolutely horrified the locals. And the people of St Ives had never seen anything like it before, and they banned them from the pubs and from cafes and restaurants. They said they were the great unwashed. And of course they were perfectly respectable young men and women who were at college, but they, they just were coming down on holiday. And then they sort of put their good clothes on and get on the train and go back to college. But it caused such a furore, we have a whole file on it at the archive, that the council, the way they dealt with it was to take the wall down. Because they thought that if they took the wall down, you see, the windows would go away. Unfortunately, they made one terrible mistake, because it brought the sea in, because the wall was actually there to keep the sea out. So they had to do something else to replace it. But I think it's worth saying that, because, that is really...
You would think they would have known that.
No, I don't really. Do you know? Focused on it. Well, I think this is really interesting, because, and perhaps we can talk about this, because you have a situation, whatever it is, and it's a new situation.
Yeah.
And how do you deal with it? And that's when often everything goes wrong. Nobody can really think things sensibly, and they often make exactly the wrong decision. Instead of, I don't know, do you think that this is, this happens all the time, or?
Yes, I'm sure it happens all the time. But I think this is a wonderful metaphor. You kind of feel concerned about something, so you try to kind of eliminate the thing that you're concerned about without realizing the wider impact that it has. But what I'm really curious about is the way that current thinking around community is getting a lot more inclusive, if you like. I think it's getting a lot more creative about saying, well, let's look at this whole picture. Not just kind of looking at instances, but let's look at kind of our whole economy as a local community, or let's look at our whole attitude towards food growing, whatever it might be. I think that's indicative of how things were there. And then, I do think things have moved on a bit, but mistakes definitely get made all the time. I was just thinking about television and how that kind of democratizes learning and how more people were exposed to art and notions about art through television. And that must be one of the reasons why cultural tourism then went on the rise. When you've got all these programs on television about kind of places all over the world which you could go and visit, and then you get cheap travel. And it makes it possible. People no longer feel blocked there because they don't understand it or that it's not for them. Everybody is now able to access art and culture.
There is, and it goes back to what you're talking about, sort of high culture and low culture. And are we saying that coming to the Tate is high culture and coming and being on the beach is low culture, less high culture? And I think we need to look at that. We'll look at that in more detail later. What I was going to say was we did have a bit of culture, high culture earlier on. And dear Barbara Hepworth in 1953 felt that she wanted to do something like Aldeburgh and have this fantastic festival of the music and the arts in St Ives to celebrate the Queen's coronation. And she and her friends, Michael Tippett and Peter Hills and all sorts of great and good in all different cultural areas, put on this most incredibly ambitious programme, and which was celebrating both the first Elizabeth and the second Elizabeth, and there were art exhibitions. But of course it was a complete flop because nobody had any money. And it was
5 shillings, that was a lot.
It was huge, wasn't it? I know. And it was, I mean, they had Shakespeare, they had, you know, the music, Baroque music, I mean, terribly exciting stuff, but they couldn't get any audiences, or very small audiences. And I think she'd hoped that there'd be something like the Aldeburgh Festival, which would come every year, and the council had actually put a lot of energy and money into it, and they said, never again. It's very interesting to read, or we've got all the letters at the archive as to, you know, what actually happened. But she did try, which is interesting. And of course, we have to remember that she and Bernard Leach were given the freedom of the borough in 1968. So they were very much part of the establishment. And by her presenting the town with works of art in different places, you know, it sort of kind of raised the profile, I think you said, and gave it, oh, sorry, it's not a very good photograph, it's all been squashed, apologies about that one. But, you know, that has always been at the heart of St Ives for a number of years.
And how much of alienation was there? You were saying of the beatniks in the 60s. Well, what evidence was there alienation of the artists who were here? They were different from the normal folk that were here.
Well, it's very interesting you should say that, because there'd been artists here since the 1880s. So having artists around was just like seeing anybody else.
There was Newlyn as well.
There was Newlyn, but St Ives was different because the artists were part of the community. In Newlyn, they weren't, because Newlyn didn't have the infrastructure. It was just a place for fishermen. In St Ives, it was big enough that had a place for galleries, for art organisations, to buy art materials, and there were shops, you see. Well, Newlyn isn't like that, so the artists moved out. They moved to live in Lamorna because the houses in Newlyn were not suitable for living in. Whereas in St Ives, they actually became a really big part of the town. And there's a whole lot of talk on that. Pardon?
What was the difference between St Ives, though? I mean, I know the history of when, you know, Bob Hepworth came here, it was a centre, there was Mondrian, there was all sorts of people came to visit when they were in Cobbles Bay. Then they moved to St Ives. Now, okay, there were artists here, but not artists of that much quality until this sort of thing happened.
Well, now hold on a moment. That's a very, very
nasty comment.
No, You can't say that. Until the First World War, the art, you might say that the work that was done here was more conventional, but there were some really great artists who came from all over the world who were very important. And it's a whole other thing we can talk about. And in fact, St. Ives brought together those early artists. They came from all over the place, and they were extraordinarily successful, many of them, and they painted the most superb works. What you're talking about is the modernists, and that's a whole other story. And how did the modernists fit in with the traditionalists? But I think we can't go down that route. Yeah. But because I don't think there is not time. But the point about it is that there had always been artists since the railway came. There'd always been artists here. They'd always been part of the community. They drank in the sloop inn. In the early days, they were town councillors. They belonged to the golf club. They belonged to the tennis club. They joined choirs. You know, there was no difference. Certainly, they were linked with the more professional classes, you could say. But many of them drank in the sloop inn and knew the fishermen. So they were very, very integrated. Exactly. So, as time went on, yes, you could say that a number of people didn't understand the modern paintings, but that happened all over the place. I mean, that was not just happening in St. Ives. There was always this sort of not knowing what they were painting. But again, that's another story. But I showed you this because this is Virginia Woolf's house. And so you've got to remember that this was a very cultured area, and there were writers and poets and musicians here, and people would continue to come down and see Virginia Woolf's house. So we mustn't, you know, just make it very narrow. But what I wanted to do now was, because let's fast forward to when we were the St. Ives Tate Action Group. And we were trying to raise money and awareness. There were two things, really. First of all, people said, why do we want yet another gallery? This town is absolutely full of galleries. And as the years went on, everyone said, a lot of people said, locals said, St. Ives isn't like it used to be. So I thought, I have got some photographs here of 1985, and you can actually see what St. Ives looked like in 1985. And I think this is really important, because I think if we're not careful, we can look through the past through rose-coloured spectacles. Now I know things change, and they change everywhere, but we're not talking about some halcyon time. In fact, when I came down in 1985, the place was dying on its feet. In the winter time, the place was completely shut down. Half the shops closed. It was a pretty dreary town, because there weren't the visitors anymore, so there wasn't the money coming in. So here we are looking along. Here's the Warren, there's the Arts Club, do you see there? And as we go down, here's the church. That was the old Lewes there beside West Pier. We carry on down, there's Woolworths, which got in a bad state. Here's what it looked like on Porthmere, with a few bathing huts and meadow flats, and the space where the gasworks was, I mean, it must have been running with rats and things, and it was just horrible. And look at this. This is Key House at the end of Key Street. You can't say that here was St. Ives being, you know, it wasn't a lively, vibrant place. And I think it's worth understanding that. And this was for the holiday makers, okay? Lag Saltings, Merlin's Magic Land. This was at the roundabout where the garden centre is. And look at this. Cornucopia, one of Europe's leading model railway attractions. Don't miss it, but I don't know. But it, you know, that was what was the culture, if you like, for the holiday makers at that time.
Yeah.
And then you see it has changed tremendously, and this is really the crux of things, because what has happened is that all these good things have happened, that St Ives in the 1980s was not, it wasn't at all rich, it was struggling, people were only visiting for a very short number of weeks. What happens? And I show this to start with because there's the gasworks, so that's the 1930s. Here it is, I took this photograph on Sunday, fantastic weather, there's the Tate. Now, that's how it was when it was built. And look at this very carefully. There's the meadow flats. That's what it looks like now. If you want to, if you look at that view there, that's what you see. We've lost the Tate altogether. It has been completely crowded out by modern apartments. Look at that place behind. And what has happened is that the exact opposite has happened. That money has poured into the town. It's now the place to visit. And every developer under the sun is building as many apartments as they can on the smallest piece of ground to make as much money as possible. Most of the accommodation in this area is let out. Another project undertaken by Potts Construction, Cornish Gems. And the view up the hill, up the terrace, what have we got up there?
My goodness.
We don't see the Portsmouth Hotel anymore because we've got that huge. We've got this beautiful iconic view of looking down Barning Hill, Parish Church, and what have we got now? That disgusting white building that nobody is in at the Malakoff, completely dominating that beautiful site. And at the back of the Tate, that's all those smart apartments that people never live in. They'll just stay and have holidays there. And this is my last picture, and then we'll open it up to conversation, because this is appalling. This is Friday's Times and Echo. Read this. St Ives has come out as one of the most popular holiday destinations in the UK, according to a new survey. The survey based its results on the quality of restaurants and independent shops in the town. The survey was carried out by Visit Cornwall, which shows St Ives has the second highest visitor-related spend in the county, bringing in £85 million a year. It was Newquay that pushed St Ives into second place. Although the borough of St Ives only has a population of 11,000, its visitor numbers see the population at least triple in the peak summer months. The figures come from a survey carried out in 2012, which found St Ives had 540,000 day visitors and more than 217,000 staying visitor trips. And nowhere is there anything about the Tate, about culture, or people coming in and spending more money. When you read that, I saw red when I read that article, and I thought that Visit Cornwall is a sort of spin-off from Cornwall Council, and that's what's important. And okay, over to you. I just think I've just learned so much from all of that, you know, putting all that together, and that coming up on Friday really dispirits me.
I think that's such an interesting place to kind of arrive at after having done this journey through the history of St Ives and seeing how the culture's shifted. And for me, it's bringing up all sorts of questions about kind of who makes the decisions and whose culture is it, and what does it mean to be a resident here? I mean, what's it like to be a resident in a place where visitors come and go in such huge numbers? And I know that also kind of key shops in the town are disappearing, and that particularly in the winter months there's no real feeling of community. So I'm kind of, for me it's bringing up all these questions about how do communities value their culture, and how do they define their culture? Because I don't think culture is just defined by Tates and Ives. Yeah, it's defined in all these other ways that we've been looking at. It's defined by fishing, although fishing doesn't exist very much any longer. And it's defined by what used to be light industry here. There's hardly any light industry left. So the diversity of ways of earning money in this community is being kind of severely reduced. That's kind of where we wanted to take the conversation, I think, wasn't it?
You see, without the Tate, which has been at the heart of everything, so many good things have happened. And, I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the future? How is it going to develop? Tate is going to have its phase 2 because it's completely, I mean, we haven't gone into that, because it's completely outgrown what it was here for. It's been so popular. And it's, I mean, I think we'll pursue that in talk number 3. But nevertheless, it is a really major employer. It has done, we've got all these wonderful spin-off things, we've got marvellous places to eat, and yet, is it that some people just don't see it? What do you think?
I think it's our press. I think it's our local paper.
Yes, I do.
I'm
really
surprised that you were surprised.
Well,
because it's always like that. It's always like that paper.
yeah, it is. Yeah, but Tony had a lot to do with it. I mean, we all worked together on the September Festival. But you know, I'm not sure about Visit Cornwall, you see, in Malcolm Bell. I think that it's more complicated than that. I think that when people think about tourism and people coming here, they think of people having their holidays and being on the beach.
I think you've got to look at the paper as a whole, actually, because you look at the letters that you read, and you look at the editor's little note afterwards. He has a bias, and it's comical sometimes.
Well, I absolutely
I would buy the newspaper.
I just wanted to add about the comment that you made about what changed with Barbara Hepburn, and I think it was entirely our national media that changed. That's why we know so much about moderns that we didn't necessarily know about people at the turn of the century coming here, which has since been filled in with the research that people have carried out. But I think the modernists, they brought their publicity machine out to the provinces, and that has a lot to register the view that we have of our society from the 1940s thereafter, really, following the war years. And I think that's what makes the change in the way people perceive it, is because our historiography of information, you look at what came out at what date and by whom it was said, and their background interests that I referred to earlier, the political and economic situation, is exactly where we get to with the paper today. Whose view is it, if you do a critique of our own local paper? I mean, all of the tourists that are here now are probably here because of the Tate coming here, because the Tate's publicity machine has advanced its presence, and the people that engage with that. And I think the pole of the high and low various cultural elements would be very interesting to take a measure and a marker of that, and reasons why different parts of society come here. Is it achievable?
But I think in a way there's another point to all this, and that is that the council, and this has been going on now for many years, goes back reading the papers to the 1960s, and that is that they are perfectly happy for money to be made in this town by tourism, and not through any other ways. That they don't think it's good. When the industry disappeared in the 50s and 60s, mainly because the factories were down more, and as places expanded, they needed larger lorries, and of course the streets were very narrow, and so they didn't want to increase, the traffic and make, because the factories would need to expand. So they, first of all, they put them into industrial estate around the edge. But it's never really taken off. And if you read the newspapers. The council has never, they've always, it's almost like taking the easy way out, that you get the money from the tourists rather than diversifying and putting money into other things as well. Supposing something happened like when all the tourists stopped coming because many of them, because they went to Spain. Supposing something happened like that again, where would St Ives be?
Well, in your point about community resilience, that is what St Ives should be looking at, because when fuel is reduced, and the availability or price to stop people coming, that will affect every way to this peninsula possible. And that's more than likely to be the 50-year ahead thing that stops people coming down here. But on an economic point of view, it's not just the council, I think, imposing their financial view. The community themselves resist. I'm not talking about necessarily development of holiday homes or apartments and flats. The community resisted the development of a £10 million nursing home, which would have brought jobs and services for the community. So it is extremely complex.
Yes, very complex.
It isn't as straightforward, I think, as it used to be perhaps 10 years ago. And the element of community resilience has got to bring in all of these aspects. And I'm quite pleased, I've only been here 14 years, but I'm quite pleased we've got the Tate, actually. Really pleased we've got the Tate.
We all are. I mean, the point is that it's transformed the town. It's transformed every part of lives down here. But what I'm saying is that can be some downsides, and I think we need to recognise those and to say, how are we going to deal with it? And is it in our powers to do anything about it? Perhaps, you know, that's sort of really up your street, isn't it? What do you think we do have the powers to do something about it, to perhaps reclaim things that we might have lost?
I think you do have the power to do that. I think there needs to be a kind of conversation that involves many people in the community around that. I know you're doing your neighbourhood plan at the moment, so a lot of people are getting engaged in that and beginning to think about what sort of development is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. But I see this happening in, well, a lot of communities all over the place are beginning to wake up to the fact that they could be more resilient but aren't, and they're wondering what to do about it. I certainly think here in St Ives we've got the situation where, you know, to go and see an optician, apparently you have to now go outside the town, is that right?
No, respect.
Harvest Bay, okay. But I know you've lost a lot of essential services.
Yes. There's not many shops that actually sell what you need.
Yes, exactly. So there must come a point where the community... So the community, in a sense, must be starting to question whether reliance solely on tourism is actually being, to some extent, counterproductive. And while the Tate is fantastic, and we all applaud it being here, is there a kind of a bit of rebalancing that could happen? Is there a conversation to be had about, well, actually, how can we ring-fence more of our community life in such a way that we've got more spaces for the community to meet in, or we've got more kind of opportunity for the community to have a voice in what they want to see happen?
Well, most of those spaces are under threat, aren't they, at the moment?
Yeah.
All of those spaces.
Yeah.
We're at a certain point now in this town that it could, you know, it's
They could
beyond
disappear.
everything, actually. You know, it's quite worrying for the town.
Yes, but also for the community to define what it thinks its culture is. And you can define culture not just in the kind of physical culture that you've got here, i.e. the kind of beautiful buildings or Tates and Ives or whatever it might be, but culture is also the vibrancy of a community. It's also the kind of peace of mind that people in the community have about being able to live here in a way that kind of feels they're supported, and in a way in which they can imagine their children and grandchildren finding jobs here. That's also culture. So I think there is an opportunity here to kind of open up this question as to what culture could be, and to say that community cohesion and things like that are as important as built culture.
Might too be mentioning in the last talk that on the first day galleries were open to the public, there were queues down the street, and no one had any idea what to do about the queue because they hadn't imagined that might happen. It's gone 5:30 now. I think we said we'd probably wrap things up after an hour and a half. I don't really want to kind of jump in and cut this conversation off because I think there are many ways that we could go. I actually have a meeting to go to, so I need to leave. Happy to leave everyone talking. But whether or not you kind of carry on the conversation, I'd want to take this moment to thank Isabel and to Janet for being in the conversation. And yeah, round of applause.